In March of 2016, Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington found itself in the center of a bizarre conspiracy theory known as Pizzagate. Believers allege that a satanic cabal of Democratic Party politicians, including then presidential candidate Hilary Clinton, several Hollywood celebrities, and other industry leaders, were kidnapping children by the thousands. The children were used in satanic rituals and murdered. In 2017, Pizzagate became a pillar of a much larger far-right conspiracy theory called QAnon. The movement believed that then President Donald Trump was covertly waging a war on this demonic cabal. Pizzagate was not a new development. It was an evolution of a moral panic that gripped the US and the Western world 40 years previous. In the 1980s, vigilante parents dug under a preschool searching for secret tunnels used for satanic rituals. The police swapped tips on how to identify pagan symbols. A toothpaste company had to deny repeatedly that it was acting as an agent of Satan. And a popular role-playing game was accused of being a tool of the occult. Laws were passed to help combat the epidemic of satanic ritual abuse, and it resulted in the longest and most expensive criminal case in the history of the United States. It was known as the Satanic Panic. In 1973, Canadian psychiatrist Lawrence Pazder began treating a patient called Michelle Smith at his practice in Victoria, British Columbia. Pazder was treating Smith for depression, and in 1976, Smith suffered a miscarriage. Her depression and anxiety deepened, and she began having terrible nightmares. In one session, she told Pazder that she felt she had something to tell him, but she couldn't remember what it was. Pazder decided to employ a novel type of psychotherapy, hypnosis. And from there, their sessions began to delve into increasingly bizarre territory. From the summer of 1976 until late November 1977, several days a week, often for 5 to 6 hours a day, Smith began to recount long-forgotten events in the childhood voice of her 5-year-old self. She told Pazder her mother had offered her up to a satanic cult to be used in a series of rituals with the aim of raising the devil himself. Smith alleged her mother had told her, "You're not mine anymore, Michelle. You belong to the devil." Smith described terrible and bizarre rituals, each session building on the horror of the one before, eventually becoming so nightmarish that the therapist, a devout Catholic, brought in priests to protect Smith from the evil of her own memories. In the book's climax, Smith encounters Satan himself in a ritual called the Feast of the Beast. A passage from the book reads, "You never see him all at once. He's always distorted, and he's not quite substantial, more like vapor. He opens his mouth, and it's all fire." As the devil is about to consume the young Michelle and complete the summoning ritual, Michelle's prayers are answered. Jesus, followed by the Virgin Mary, appear and rescue Michelle from her nightmare. Pazder recorded 600 hours of audio while Smith was in a hypnotic state. These recordings would become the basis of their book, Michelle Remembers. Funded by a $100,000 advance, it would earn another $242,000 in paperback rights and royalties, about $1 million today when adjusted for inflation. The book's claims seemed so extraordinary and its evidence so lacking that it's difficult to imagine anyone believing them to be true. But they did. Smith and Pazder, now a married couple, began appearing on talk shows in Canada and the US. Pazder became recognized as the foremost expert on satanic ritual abuse, his professional credentials adding credibility to the book's claims.
I knew Michelle very well through 4 years of therapy, intensive therapy, and there was no evidence of any of this kind of material present, but I knew her personality and everything. When she came to me a year after it had been discontinued and went into a very deep level of consciousness and began to relive, essentially, to see, to hear, to feel, and to tell me in detail these events for 14 months of what happened to her as a child, it was very difficult for me to decide where it was coming from. I looked to see, was it imagination, was it hysteria, where was it coming from, was it psychosis? I have to say that the evidence is clear that this came from an experience that Michelle had. There has been nothing that I've been able to unearth that says it didn't, and there are many things pointing to the fact that in fact it did, and it challenges where psychiatry is, where our beliefs are, how we work with people. It brings many new horizons, but particularly it's a story of hope.
Soon other survivors were coming forward, claiming they too had repressed memories of abuse at the hands of devil worshippers. Child abuse was a reality, as it is today, but in the 1980s, after decades of denial, society was finally grappling with the issue. Depending on where you get your statistics, up to 90% of abusers are people children know, love, and trust. This is a difficult fact to deal with, and Michelle Remembers offered people an alternative. A villain outside of the family, a target that could be fought and eliminated. The devil himself. Ken Lanning, a former FBI agent who worked on hundreds of abuse cases with the Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit, would say, the evidence wasn't there, but the allegations of satanic ritual abuse never really went away. When people get emotionally involved in an issue, common sense and reason go out the window. People believe what they want and need to believe. A moral panic was beginning to take shape. Born in Dayton, Ohio, James Dallas Egbert was considered something of a child prodigy. In 1978, the 16-year-old had enrolled in Michigan State University as a computer science major. On August 15, 1979, Egbert went missing. As the days passed, with no sign of the boy, his family hired private investigator William Deere. Deere traveled to Michigan State and discovered that Egbert was struggling to deal with pressure relating to his school performance, possible drug use, and he was also grappling with his sexual identity. In Egbert's dorm room, Deere found a corkboard filled with thumbtacks in what initially seemed to be a random pattern. But in the placement of the tacks, Deere saw a clue. He realized that the pattern of the tacks resembled the shape of a building on campus, the Simon Power Plant. The plant provides steam used to heat and cool about 500 buildings across the university campus. The steam is carried through the campus in over 10 miles or 16 kilometers of underground tunnels. When Deere searched the tunnels, he found evidence that Egbert had been there, although the investigator wasn't sure why, but he had a hunch that it had something to do with a game that was growing in popularity. In 1974, game publishing company TSR released a fantasy role-playing game called Dungeons & Dragons. D&D players working collaboratively and led by a dungeon master adventure through stories about brave warriors locked in combat with trolls, orcs, dragons, and other evildoers. Roughly 1,000 copies of the game were sold in that first year, followed by 3,000 in 1975. As the game became more popular, some religious figures began suggesting that it was a corrupting influence, steering impressionable young players towards self-harm and even murder. James Dallas Egbert was a fan of science fiction, fantasy, and an avid Dungeons & Dragons player. Deere believed that Egbert had taken to playing Dungeons & Dragons in the tunnels beneath the campus, and as the boy attempted to escape the pressures of adult life, he lost himself in the game's fantasy world. When Deere gave a statement to the media, he omitted that Egbert had been suffering with serious personal issues, and instead only offered his theory about Dungeons & Dragons. Media attention exploded. It turned out that Egbert had attempted to take his own life in the tunnels on the day of his disappearance, but failed. He then went to his uncle's home. The older man arranged transportation for him to New Orleans, where Egbert made a second unsuccessful attempt on his life. With media attention growing, his uncle urged him to contact Dear. Dear reunited the teen with his family, and Egbert attempted to resume a normal life. He switched schools and remained in contact with the detective, but Egbert continued to struggle with drug use, and his relationship with his parents deteriorated. Tragically, in August of 1980, Egbert made another attempt on his life, and this time he succeeded. Before his death, Egbert admitted that his issues stemmed from academic and parental pressure, only made worse with drug use. Gaming played no part in his disappearance. Michelle Remembers was published just weeks after Egbert's death, and when another death was linked to D&D, the sparks of a moral panic became a fire. In June of 1982, high school student Irving Lee Pulling was found dead in front of his house. There was a gunshot wound in his chest. When the police arrived and began to investigate, they informed Irving Lee's parents that the gunshot wound was self-inflicted. The teen had taken his own life. He had left 6 letters addressed to friends, a teacher, and 1 to his parents. The investigators asked them a strange question. "Mrs. Pulling, are you or your husband devil worshippers?" The teen's mother, Patricia, was given her son's letter. "Dear Mom and Dad," it began, as he confessed to hearing voices and being told to commit murder. He felt he was becoming evil, Antichrist evil, but was choosing to end his own life instead. Irving Lee Pulling was known as Bink, and his classmates described him as an unusually bright youth who was enrolled in the school's talented and gifted program for students with high IQs. They also said, however, that he had trouble fitting in. Shortly before his death, he wrote "Life is a Joke" on the blackboard in one of his classes. Prior to his death, Bink was an active Dungeons & Dragons player. His bedroom was decorated with Dungeons & Dragons paraphernalia, and he was a member of his school's Dungeons & Dragons club, a club that was set up and run by a teacher. Bink's mother, Patricia Pulling, became convinced that his participation in the game was directly related to his death. They discovered that just hours before Bink's death, another D&D player reportedly placed a curse on him. It read, "Your soul is mine, and I choose the time. At my command, you'll reave the land, a follower of evil, a killer of man." It was all the proof she needed. Patricia sued the high school principal for $1 million, and she sued TSR, the makers of Dungeons & Dragons, for $10 million, claiming that this curse was intended to inflict emotional distress at a time when Bink was already under extreme psychological stress and emotional pressure from playing Dungeons & Dragons. Patricia Pulling's lawsuits were quickly rejected, so she formed an advocacy group called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. The group published a pamphlet exposing the dangers of D&D, and by 1985, Patricia had compiled a long list of teenage deaths she linked to the game. This was a goldmine for the media, and Patricia was soon a regular on the talk show circuit, bringing a photo of Bink wherever she went. On many of these media appearances, she was joined by Dr. Thomas Radecki, who was identified as a psychiatrist and chairman of the National Coalition on Television Violence, an organization of which Patricia Pulling was also a member. At the time, CBS was airing a Saturday morning cartoon based on Dungeons & Dragons. Radecki lobbied for it to be cancelled, and it was. Patricia Pulling got her private investigator's license and styled herself as an occult crime fighter. She began giving seminars to law enforcement about the occult warning signs to look out for when investigating teenage deaths. Together with Thomas Radecki, she acted as an expert witness in trials involving the occult. In all her talks and media appearances, Patricia Pulling omitted information about Bink's mental health problems and his difficulty in fitting in at school. She presented a clear message. A dungeon master had placed a death curse on Bink. It had tormented him and caused him to take his own life. Dungeons & Dragons was to blame. However, in writing his 2015 book Dangerous Games, Joseph Laycock, an assistant professor of religious studies at Texas State University, found a source that was close to Irving Lee Pulley, who revealed that Bink only played D&D at school for a total of 9 hours. The source believed Bink took his own life as an act of aggression towards his mother. His parents' marriage was troubled, and both Patricia and her husband were having extramarital affairs. Bink ended his life using a pistol that belonged to his mother, and he did so on the front porch, in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to shock and horrify his parents when they returned home. In 1990, Patricia Pulling stepped down as the head of BAD, and the group faded into obscurity. In March of 1992, Thomas Radecki had his medical license revoked as a result of allegations of inappropriate sexual activity with one of his female patients. In 2016, he was convicted and jailed for trading opioid addiction treatment drugs for sex. Where Patricia Pulling's BAD organization was a relatively small group of concerned parents, in Washington, D.C., a much more official group was formed with the goal of restricting access to music that contained problematic themes, including sex, violence, and the occult. The Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC, was formed in 1984 by 4 women known for their ties to Washington's political life, including Susan Baker, wife of then Treasury Secretary James Baker, and Tipper Gore, wife of Senator and future Vice President Al Gore. In a letter to the Record Industry Association of America, the group proposed that record companies either cease the production of music with violent and sexually charged lyrics or develop a rating system similar to the one used by the film industry. Violent lyrics would be marked with a V, lyrics referencing drugs or alcohol with a D or A, and satanic or occult content with an O. The issue was discussed at a Senate hearing in September of 1985. Frank Zappa was a witness, and he had this to say about the PMRC proposals.
The PMRC proposal is an ill-conceived piece of nonsense which fails to deliver any real benefits to children, infringes the civil liberties of people who are not children, and promises to keep the courts busy for years dealing with the interpretational and enforcemental problems inherent in the proposal's design.
Less than 2 months after the congressional hearing, the PMRC and the Record Industry Association announced a compromise. Albums could either bear the label explicit lyrics, parental advisory, or have all their lyrics printed on the back cover. In 1990, the now standard black and white warning label was introduced. In the months before the Senate hearings, the moral panic came for consumer goods company Procter & Gamble. Flyers began circulating across the east coast of the US, accusing the P&G president of financially supporting the Church of Satan. The company's logo also came under scrutiny. Featuring a bearded figure and 13 stars, some claimed an inverted 666 was hidden in the curls of the man's beard. P&G spent years fighting off these claims and changed their logo. The satanic panic had spread to consumer goods, gaming, and music, but it reached its zenith when it found in Utah daycare centers. In August of 1983, at the same time Patricia Pulling launched her lawsuit against TSR, Judy Johnson, a resident of a wealthy Los Angeles suburb, told police she suspected her 3-year-old son Matthew was being molested by one of his preschool teachers, Ray Buckey. Despite the fact that the young boy was unable to identify Ray from photos, the police conducted a search of Buckey's home and arrested the 25-year-old on September 7, 1983. The next day, Police Chief Harry Kuhlmeyer sent a letter to about 200 families, asking for help with their investigation. The following procedure is obviously an unpleasant one. To protect the rights of your children as well as the rights of the accused, this inquiry is necessary. The police chief went on to list the possible criminal acts under investigation. Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or been a victim. John Myers, a professor at the University of California, Hastings, and a lawyer who represents child victims of abuse, called the letter a model of what not to do. Soon, other parents of children at the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach alerted police that their children had confessed to being fondled, molested, and forced to participate in explicit films. Judy Johnson's reports of misbehavior at the McMartin preschool became increasingly bizarre. She claimed that Peggy Bucky, Ray's mother, was involved in satanic practices. She was said to have taken Johnson's son to a church, where the boy was made to watch a baby being beheaded and then was forced to drink the blood. Investigators soon recognized her allegations were a product of paranoid schizophrenia, but it was too late. The growing accusations and demands from parents led to a full-scale investigation. Bowing to this pressure, the district attorney's office brought in psychiatrist and Michelle Remembers author Lawrence Pazder to consult on the case. The DA also handed a major portion of the continuing investigation over to Key McFarlane, a consultant for the Children's Institute International, or CII, an agency with the mission of identifying and treating abused children. Parents were encouraged to send their children to CII for interviews lasting 2 hours. McFarlane took 400 children through a series of leading questions. The interviews often followed a pattern. At first, children generally denied seeing any evidence of abuse. Eventually, however, many children began to tell McFarlane the stories she clearly wanted to hear. After the interviews, McFarlane told parents that their children had been abused and described the nature of alleged abuse. By March of 1984, 384 former McMartin students had been identified as being the victims of abuse. On March 22, 1984, a grand jury indicted Ray Bucky, 3 other family members, and 3 McMartin teachers on 115 counts of child sexual abuse. 2 months later, an additional 93 counts were added. By the time the preliminary hearing began in August 1984, the lead prosecutor was telling the media that the 7 defendants committed 397 sexual crimes, far more than the number for which they were indicted. Searches of the McMartin preschool and the homes of the defendants failed to produce much incriminating evidence. No nude photographs of children were discovered, despite the insistence of investigators and parents that such photographing was commonplace at McMartin. In March 1985, a group of nearly 50 McMartin parents, who had organized themselves into an advocacy group called Believe the Children, began digging at a lot next to the school, looking for the underground rooms where many children confessed the ritual abuse had taken place. A few days later, the parents were joined in their efforts by an archaeological firm hired by the district attorney's office. Still, no secret rooms were ever discovered. Key McFarlane testified that her interview method involved using anatomically correct dolls and a set of puppets, through which she asked the children questions. Videotapes of the interviews showed that McFarlane and other therapists relied heavily on leading questions and subtle pressure to persuade children to join the chorus of accusers. One tape showed a therapist telling a child interviewee that 183 kids had already revealed yucky secrets and that all the McMartin teachers were sick in the head and deserved to be beaten up. By September 1985, and well over a year into the preliminary hearing, some members of the prosecution's own team began to express doubts about the case. One prosecutor was quoted as saying, "Key McFarlane could make a 6-month-old baby say he was molested." The 2 co-prosecutors in the case urged dropping all charges against 5 of the 7 defendants. The prosecution would push ahead with charges against only Ray Bucky and his mother Peggy. So far, the case had cost Los Angeles County $4 million, and the trial had yet to begin. The trial began on July 14, 1987. the prosecution produced several parent witnesses to lay a foundation for the accounts of their children that would follow. Typically, parents would testify that prior to Chief Kuhlmeyer's infamous letter, they had no reason to suspect that his or her child had been molested. After taking the children to CII and talking with Key McFarlane, however, the parents became convinced that their children had been sexually abused. The key witness in the trial was CII therapist Key McFarlane herself. In her 5 weeks on the stand, McFarlane fought to defend her controversial interview techniques. Before McFarlane finished her lengthy testimony, even Judge William Pounders was expressing concern about her techniques. Outside of the presence of the jury, Pounders declared, "In my view, her credibility is becoming more of an issue as she testifies here." On November 2nd, 1989, after nearly 30 months of testimony, the case went to the jury. They spent another 2.5 months deliberating. On 52 of the 65 remaining charges against the two defendants, including all the charges against Peggy Buckey, the jury returned an acquittal. On the 13 remaining charges against Ray Buckey, the jury announced that it was hopelessly deadlocked. The jury foreperson said, "The interview tapes were too biased, too leading. That's the main crux of it." During the trial, NBC had commissioned a program about satanic ritual abuse hosted by Geraldo Rivera, who described gruesome crimes and aired child testimony of abuse. Almost 20 million homes tuned in. This kept the flames of the panic alive, and despite the verdict, the public pressure that had prompted the district attorney to launch the prosecution in the first place hadn't gone away. In 1990, District Attorney Ira Reiner signed off on a retrial. The second trial was a much more focused proceeding, involving only Ray Buckey, 8 counts of molestation, and 3 children. The prosecution presented its entire case in just 13 days and offered only 11 witnesses. This time, Key McFarlane was not called as a prosecution witness, although she was called as a defense witness. Jury deliberations after the 3-month trial were described as excruciating. The jury ended its deliberations deadlocked on all 8 counts. The jury leaned towards acquittal on 8 of the counts and leaned towards conviction on only 1 count. Following the mistrial, the district attorney chose not to retry Buckey a 3rd time, and all charges against him were dismissed. At this point, the trial had cost $15 million, and Ray Buckey had spent 5 years in jail for a crime most agree he didn't commit. The school shut down for good in January 1984, but no evidence, nothing at all, was ever recovered. In 2005, a former McMartin student gave an interview to the Los Angeles Times saying, "I lied. It was an ordeal." When asked about the interviews with Key McFarlane when he was 8 years old, he said, "I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to get out of here unless I tell them what they want to hear." TV host Geraldo Rivera also apologized. In 1995, he released a statement saying, "I want to announce publicly that as a firm believer of the Believe the Children movement of the 1980s that started with the McMartin trials in California, I am now convinced that I was terribly wrong, and many innocent people were convicted and went to prison as a result." And he was right. Nearly 200 people were charged with crimes over the course of the Satanic Panic, and dozens were convicted. Many defendants were eventually freed, sometimes after years in prison. 3 Arkansas teenagers who became known as the West Memphis Three were freed in 2011, almost 20 years after they were convicted of murders that prosecutors portrayed as a satanic sacrifice. In 2013, Dan and Fred Keller, owners of the Oak Hill Daycare Center, were released after 21 years in prison. The Kellers were convicted of multiple charges relating to ritual abuse of children and sentenced to 48 years in prison. The children's claims are now believed to have been false memories planted by the suggestive questioning of parents, law enforcement, and therapists. The couple was awarded $3.4 million from a state fund for wrongful convictions. In 1994, researchers with the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect found that investigators could not substantiate any of the roughly 12,000 accusations of satanic ritual abuse that had been reported during the panic. The satanic panic of the 80s and 90s was a social contagion. And in 2016's Pizzagate, we see that it's a contagion that's lying dormant, but it can too easily begin to spread again. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and consider subscribing to the channel.